"Sir, your service doesn't qualify for military honors. You need to leave now." The funeral home director's voice sliced through the heavy air of the small, dimly lit parlor, sharp and cold as a winter wind. The man, mid-30s, with a pressed suit and a sneer that curled his lip, stood behind a polished mahogany desk, cluttered with papers and a flickering computer screen. His words landed like a slap across the face of 78-year-old Benjamin Ben Carver, a Vietnam War veteran who stood clutching a worn leather satchel, his shoulders hunched but his eyes blazing with a quiet fire. The room smelled of stale lilies and furniture polish, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes and lingered in your memory. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows, painting the carpet in hues of red and gold. A small crowd of mourners dressed in somber blacks and grays milled about near the open casket of Ben's old war buddy, Tommy Grayson. The soft hum of their whispers filled the space, but the director's words had cut through it all, loud enough to turn heads. A woman in a navy dress gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, while an older man in a tweed jacket muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Ben's heart thudded in his chest, a dull ache spreading as the director's words sank in. He'd come here to honor Tommy, his brother in arms, the man who'd saved his life in a sweltering jungle ambush in '68. Ben had spent the morning polishing his old service medals, pinning them carefully to his faded blazer, the one he hadn't worn since his wife's funeral 5 years prior. His hands, gnarled from years of hard labor and arthritis, trembled slightly as he adjusted the bronze star on his chest, its weight a reminder of sacrifices long buried. He'd even practiced his salute in the mirror, wanting to get it just right for Tommy. And now this smug bureaucrat in a cheap suit was telling him his service, his sacrifice, meant nothing. "Excuse me?" Ben's voice was low, steady, but laced with a tremor of disbelief. His gray eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, locked onto the director's. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I carried men out of fire." Tommy did too. "And you're telling me he doesn't qualify for honors because of some paperwork?" The director, whose name tag read Jeremy, leaned forward, his hands splayed on the desk. "Rules are rules, old man. The VA didn't clear him for a military funeral. No documentation, no honors. No bugler, no flag, no nothing. Now I've got a schedule to keep, so take your complaints somewhere else." His tone dripped with condescension, each word a jab at Ben's pride. A few mourners nearby shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Ben and the director. A young woman in a black cardigan whispered to her companion, her voice too low to catch but her frown unmistakable. Ben's grip tightened on the satchel, where he kept a folded photograph of him and Tommy from their service days, grinning, mud-streaked, and alive in a way only soldiers understand. The photo was creased from years of handling, a talisman of brotherhood that had carried Ben through decades of nightmares and loss. He'd planned to place it in Tommy's casket, a quiet gesture of farewell. But now, standing in this sterile room under Jeremy's smug gaze, Ben felt the weight of every battle he'd fought, on the battlefield and off, pressing down on him. His chest tightened, not just from age, but from the sting of being dismissed, reduced to an inconvenience in a place meant for reverence. "I'm not leaving," Ben said, his voice firmer now, though it cracked at the edges. He straightened, his posture pulling from muscle memory of standing at attention. "Tommy deserves better than this. I deserve better than this." His words hung in the air, drawing the attention of more mourners. A teenage boy in an ill-fitting suit stopped scrolling on his phone, his eyes wide as he watched Ben. An elderly woman with a walker gripped her husband's arm, her lips trembling as if she might speak up. Jeremy scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Look, I don't have time for this. You're holding up the service. If you don't leave, I'll call security." He reached for the phone on his desk, his movements sharp and deliberate, as if Ben were a stray dog to be shooed away. The threat sent a jolt through Ben's body, stirring memories of barked orders and chaos, of moments when survival hinged on standing his ground. He felt the familiar churn of anger, mixed with something deeper. Shame, perhaps, that after all these years, he still had to fight to be seen. Outside, the faint hum of traffic filtered through the walls, but inside the tension was thick, palpable. A man in a flannel shirt, another veteran by the look of his weathered cap, stepped closer to Ben, his brow furrowed. "This ain't right," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. The crowd's murmurs grew, a ripple of unease spreading. Ben's heart pounded, but he held his ground, his eyes never leaving Jeremy's. He could feel the photograph in his satchel, a silent reminder of why he was here. Not just for Tommy, but for every soldier who'd been forgotten, dismissed, cast aside. And then, through the parlor's front windows, a low rumble broke the standoff. It was distant at first, like thunder rolling in from the horizon, but it grew louder, more insistent. Heads turned, conversations halted. The ground seemed to vibrate faintly underfoot. And Ben's eyes flicked to the window, catching the glint of sunlight on something massive moving down the street. The mourners pressed closer to the glass, their voices rising in confusion and awe. Whatever was coming, it was big and it was close. We've only just begun this story, but trust me, it's about to get even more intense. Stick around to see what happens when Ben faces even greater injustice, and how he fights back. The rumble outside the funeral home grew louder, shaking the stained glass windows and rattling the cheap plastic chairs lined against the walls. Benjamin Carver stood rooted in the parlor, his weathered hands still clutching the leather satchel with Tommy's photograph inside, its edges worn soft from years of quiet reverence. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and tension. The mourners' whispers now a chaotic hum as they crowded near the windows, craning their necks to see what was causing the commotion. Ben's heart pounded, not just from the standoff with Jeremy, the smug funeral home director, but from a flicker of hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. Something was happening, something big. Jeremy, still behind his polished desk, slammed the phone down, his face flushed with irritation. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You're all disrupting a sacred service. He pointed a manicured finger at Ben. "You're the problem here. I told you, your friend doesn't get honors. No paperwork, no proof, no bugler. End of story." His words were venomous, each one a deliberate jab at Ben's dignity. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others glaring at Jeremy. A woman in a gray shawl whispered to her neighbor, her voice sharp with indignation, but no one spoke up. Not yet. Ben's jaw tightened, his gray eyes narrowing as memories flooded back. The jungles of Vietnam, the crack of gunfire, Tommy's hand pulling him from the mud as bullets tore through the air. He'd promised Tommy he'd never let their sacrifices be forgotten, and now, standing in this sterile room, he felt that promise slipping through his fingers. "You don't get to decide what Tommy's worth," Ben said, his voice low but laced with steel. "You weren't there. You didn't see what we saw, what we lost." His words trembled with a mix of grief and fury, and for a moment the room fell silent, the weight of his truth hanging heavy. Jeremy sneered, stepping out from behind the desk, his polished shoes clicking on the hardwood floor. "Oh, spare me the war stories, old man. This isn't a museum for your memories. This is a business, and you're holding up my schedule." He gestured toward two security guards in ill-fitting uniforms who had appeared at the parlor's entrance, their faces blank but their hands hovering near their radios. "Escort him out," Jeremy ordered, his tone dripping with authority. The guards hesitated, glancing at Ben, his faded blazer, the glint of his bronze star, the quiet dignity in his stance. One of them, a younger man with a buzz cut, looked uneasy, his eyes flickering with something like recognition. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a restless energy rippling through the room. "This ain't right," the veteran in the flannel shirt from earlier muttered again, louder this time, his voice carrying to the others. A teenage girl, her eyes red from crying, clutched her mother's arm and whispered, "Why are they doing this to him?" An elderly man with a cane shook his head, his voice cracking as he said, "Disgraceful, just disgraceful." The tension was a live wire, sparking with every glance, every whispered word. Ben felt it too, a surge of defiance that pushed back against the shame threatening to swallow him whole. He wasn't just fighting for Tommy anymore. He was fighting for every veteran who'd been dismissed, erased, forgotten. "I'm not going anywhere," Ben said, his voice rising, steady now despite the ache in his chest. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the photograph of him and Tommy, holding it up for all to see. The image was faded but clear. Two young soldiers, their faces smeared with dirt, their smiles defiant against the backdrop of war. "This is who you're disrespecting. This man saved lives, mine included, and you think you can just toss him aside because of some paperwork?" His words were a challenge, not just to Jeremy, but to the system that let men like Tommy fade into obscurity. Jeremy's face twisted, his patience fraying. "That's it. Get him out, now!" he barked at the guards. The younger guard took a tentative step forward, but the older one, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, held up a hand, his eyes locked on Ben's medals. "Hold on," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the growing chaos. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were part of it now, their voices rising in a chorus of discontent. A woman in a red coat shouted, "Let him stay! He's earned it!" Others nodded, their murmurs turning. "System!" The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a restless energy rippling through the room. "This ain't right," the veteran in the flannel shirt repeated, his voice now a rallying cry that emboldened others. A young woman in a black cardigan stepped forward, her phone raised, the faint click of a recording starting. "This needs to be seen," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. The room was a powder keg and Ben's defiance had lit the fuse. Outside, the rumble grew deafening. a deep mechanical roar that shook the walls and drew gasps from the mourners. Shadows moved across the windows, massive and deliberate, as the crowd pressed closer, their voices a mix of awe and confusion. We're on the edge of something huge. What happens next will turn everything upside down. You don't want to miss how this fight for justice unfolds. The funeral parlor vibrated with the thunderous roar from outside, a relentless growl that drowned out the murmurs of the mourners and sent a shiver through the polished hardwood floor. Benjamin Carver stood defiant, the faded photograph of him and Tommy Grayson trembling in his outstretched hand, its creased edges catching the dim light of the stained glass windows. His chest heaved, not just from the weight of his 78 years, but from the fire of a promise kept, to honor his brother in arms no matter the cost. The crowd, now a restless sea of faces, pressed toward the windows, their gasps and whispers mingling with the mechanical cacophony beyond. Jeremy, the funeral home director, froze mid-snarl, his smug authority crumbling as the room's attention shifted to the chaos unfolding outside. The younger security guard, his hand still hovering near his radio, stared wide-eyed at the windows where massive shadows loomed, dark and deliberate. "What in the world?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The older guard, the one with the scarred cheek, stepped closer to Ben, his expression unreadable but his posture tense, as if he sensed history unfolding. The woman in the black cardigan, still recording on her phone, pushed through the crowd, her lens trained on Ben's weathered face, capturing the quiet dignity that held the room captive. "Keep going, sir," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ben didn't hear her, but he felt the crowd's energy shift, a spark of solidarity that warmed the cold ache in his bones. Jeremy, regaining his composure, slammed his fist on the desk, the sound sharp but hollow against the roar outside. "Enough of this circus," he shouted, his face flushed with desperation. "You're all trespassing now! This service is private, and you—" He jabbed a finger at Ben. "You're done here." His words were meant to command, but they faltered as the parlor's front door burst open, letting in a gust of warm June air and the unmistakable silhouette of a man in a crisp military uniform. The crowd parted, their murmurs falling silent as Colonel Marcus Reed, a towering figure with silver hair and a chest heavy with ribbons, strode into the room. His boots echoed with purpose, and his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked onto Jeremy. "Stand down," Colonel Reed said, his voice low but carrying the weight of command. Jeremy's mouth opened, then closed, his bravado wilting under the colonel's gaze. Ben's heart skipped a beat, his grip on the photograph tightening. He didn't know this man, but the sight of the uniform stirred memories of camaraderie, of men who'd stood shoulder to shoulder in the face of hell. The colonel's presence was a lifeline, pulling Ben from the brink of despair. Behind Reed, through the open door, the source of the rumble became clear. A convoy of military vehicles, 2 M1 Abrams tanks and a Humvee, rolled to a stop in front of the funeral home, their engines idling with a growl that shook the ground. A bugler in dress blues stepped out of the Humvee, his instrument gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps, their phones flashing as they captured the surreal scene. The veteran in the flannel shirt pumped his fist, shouting, "That's what I'm talking about." The teenage girl, tears streaming down her face, clutched her mother's arm, whispering, "They came for him." The elderly woman with the walker dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her voice trembling as she said, "God bless them." Ben's throat tightened, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't expected it, but the sight of those tanks, symbols of the battles he and Tommy had fought, felt like a vindication of every scar they carried. Colonel Reed turned to Ben, his expression softening. "Mr. Carver," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd's din. "I was informed of the situation by a friend in the VFW. Your service and Mr. Grayson's has not been forgotten." He saluted Ben, a crisp, deliberate gesture that sent a ripple of awe through the room. Ben, muscle memory kicking in, returned the salute, his hand trembling but steady, the bronze star on his chest catching the light. The crowd fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on every soul in the parlor. Even Jeremy, now backed against his desk, looked small, his authority stripped bare. Reed turned to the bugler, who stood at attention near the door. "Play," he ordered. The young soldier raised the bugle to his lips, and the first notes of taps pierced the air, mournful and pure. The sound wrapped around Ben like a warm blanket, carrying him back to the jungles of Vietnam, to the faces of men lost, to Tommy's laugh in the dark. He closed his eyes, the photograph slipping from his hand to rest against his chest, a silent offering to his friend. The crowd stood still, some bowing their heads, others wiping tears, their phones lowered in respect. The woman in the red coat who'd shouted for Ben to stay let out a soft sob, her hand gripping her husband's. As the final note of taps faded, Colonel Reed stepped forward holding a folded American flag. He presented it to Ben, his hands steady, his eyes locked on the veterans. "For Thomas Grayson," he said, "and for you, Benjamin Carver. Your country thanks you." Ben took the flag, its weight heavy in his arms, a symbol of everything he'd fought for, on the battlefield and in this parlor. The crowd broke into applause, not the polite kind, but a raw, heartfelt roar that shook the walls. The teenage boy in the ill-fitting suit shouted, "That's a hero!" And others joined in, their voices a chorus of redemption. Jeremy, now a shadow of his former self, muttered something about misunderstandings and paperwork, but no one listened. The older security guard, the one with the scar, clapped a hand on Ben's shoulder, his voice gruff but warm. "You did good, soldier." Ben nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, his eyes fixed on the flag in his arms. Outside, the tank's engines revved, a final salute before they rolled away, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. The mourners began to disperse, some approaching Ben to shake his hand, others sharing quiet words of thanks. The woman with the phone slipped her device into her pocket, her eyes shining. "This is going viral," she said softly, a promise that Tommy's story, and Ben's, would live on. Ben placed the photograph in Tommy's casket, his fingers lingering on the wood. "Rest easy, brother," he whispered, his voice cracking. He stepped back, the flag still in his arms, and felt a weight lift. Not all of it, but enough to carry on. The parlor, once a battleground, now felt like hallowed ground, a place where justice had been won, not with fists, but with heart. As he walked toward the door, the crowd parting for him, Ben's steps were slow but sure, each one a testament to a life of resilience. Colonel Reed fell in beside him, offering a quiet nod. "You're not alone," he said, and Ben, for the first time in years, believed it.